Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Art of Tracking radio show. Tracking is still alive and well. Join us as we interview master trackers from around the world. We'll hear their stories, their secrets. So tune in and enjoy all you hear. Welcome.
Welcome to the Art of Tracking radio show. Today we have Filip Tkaczyk with us, the author of Tracks and Sign of Reptiles and Amphibians. Filip has been tracking for a long time and has been teaching tracking for at least 10 years now. He has achieved specialist status in the CyberTracker evaluation process, and we are very excited to have Filip with us here today. Welcome to the show, Filip.
Thanks, Garth. It's great to be in studio with you.
So, you got a new book here that's coming out in October.
That's right. Yeah, October 1st. I'm really excited to see this project completed, and it's been a passion project of mine for the past 3 years.
Great. And how did you come about to deciding to write a book on reptiles and amphibians, track and sign?
Yeah, that's not something I would have saw myself doing a few years ago. I was just focused on learning to track, and it was a conversation I had with Mark Elbrock that actually sparked the interest in that. I was taking my first specialist evaluation with him, and we were walking together from one set of tracks to another, and I just kind of wanted to pick his brain, and I said, "So Mark, when are you going to write this new tracking book for Stackpole, the one that we're all waiting for that's missing?" And that's the Tracks and Sign of Reptiles and Amphibians. And he just kind of looked at me and said, "Well, why don't you write it?" And I kind of laughed it off initially and thought, well, I'm not Mark Elbrock or somebody, so I can't do that. But honestly, the more I talked to him about it, and the more I talked to other trackers, and the more I sat with it, I realized that why not? I have the passion and the interest, and I want to see it through. So why not? So I started working on that, and then I found out that someone else was already working on that project, which is Joe Leshy, and we ended up collaborating on that. And he had been working on that for months before I even got my hands on that project. So he actually passed on a lot of the information he picked up. He was extremely generous about that, and so this project is in part his as well. And then I've had other collaborators too. Jason Knight was a co-author with me for a short time, and then a lot of trackers have contributed their knowledge of their specific bioregions, and so many people have sent me photos and been sounding boards for me, and including Jonah Evans, who's an evaluator for CyberTracker, and yeah, so this has been a collaborative effort, and although my name is on the book, a lot of people have supported me through it, including my partner Jen, and she's the mother of my son Braden, and a lot of people who have just given me support in so many ways. So yeah, this has been an amazing ride, and I don't think I could have really done it totally by myself.
Well, we're really excited to have you here and learn what we can learn from you here on the radio show and pick up your book.
Thank you, Garth.
I imagine you probably had to travel around quite a bit to accumulate all these tracks stuff. What are some of the places you had to go to?
Oh yeah, I did travel a lot. I went all across the U.S. Actually, I road tripped with my partner Jen from Seattle to Key West and back twice. I drove through the Southwest multiple times with Jen, with some friends, with coworkers. I also traveled to California a bunch of times, and so I put in, I can't even tell you how many miles I've done, but I got lucky enough to travel and create this book at the same time, do research for it, and see some of the most beautiful parts of the country, and from a tracking standpoint, some of the most interesting and exciting places like the Everglades and White Sands in New Mexico, and the Mojave Desert in California, and the national parks in Utah, and just all these mind-blowing places. So yeah, I count myself really lucky to have had a chance to travel and study out there. And gathering data was, of course, my favorite part. Being out in the field and doing that work was the best.
Yeah, I'm excited. I feel like my tracking, like reptiles and amphibians, is always kind of a very weak spot. I see tracks and I don't go much further than saying frog or salamander. So I'm really excited to be able to learn a lot more here about tracking.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I started too. I was in the same place. I would look at frog tracks and salamander tracks, and that's all I could say about them is I think this is a frog or maybe a toad, and this is some kind of salamander. And it took, several years of work and looking at the tracks and also capturing the animals and like watching them move and understanding their body mechanics and how their feet interacted with the soil. And as a tracker, that tracks are not just these stamps on the soil. They're actually, there's this dance of the substrate and the animal interacting, and it's a very dynamic process. It's an alive process. And so, just reading something in a book or hearing someone tell you isn't enough. You really have to see it and experience it. And the more you get exposed to it, then the more confidence you build and the more your knowledge grows too.
Yeah, I like that. I hear the term herp a lot, H-E-R-P, and I'm assuming that means herpetology or something. And
yes.
I guess I'm going to start at the basics here and kind of...
No, that's great.
What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What are they referring to?
So a herpetologist is someone who studies reptiles and amphibians. And so rather than constantly having to say reptiles and amphibians, you can just say herps, which are those creatures. And so when I refer to my book, usually casually I say the herp tracking book, because the title is very long. It's the Tracks and Sign of Reptiles and Amphibians of North America, which is a mouthful. So yeah, the herp tracking book just rolls off the tongue much easier. And that includes everything from frogs and toads, salamanders and newts, lizards and snakes, and alligators and crocodiles too. Those are all in that group. And turtles, of course. Turtles, tortoises. So it's a really huge group of animals. We're talking well over 700 species in the U.S. alone. And I certainly didn't cover all of them. I mean, I took a swipe at as many as I could, but I was somewhere in between 100 and 200 species that I actually got to see the tracks and sign of, and a lot of those I included in the book. So there's still a lot more to learn out there.
Great. I like learning, so that's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hear people say reptiles and amphibians are indicator species. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, so they, for instance, like frogs and toads and especially the amphibians in general are very sensitive creatures to pollution and changes in environmental conditions because they absorb, their skin's very porous, so they absorb water and they're exposed to a lot of things through their skin. Some salamanders actually don't have lungs. They actually breathe directly through their skin. They respire through their skin, which is pretty crazy to think about. And also pollution and also things like parasites. Like there's this parasite called chytrid that's making a big impact on amphibian species all over the world, but especially now in the Americas, that was introduced from outside of the New World, is killing off a lot of amphibians because they're not really used to dealing with this organism, and because their skin is porous, they don't really have a defense against it. And so most of them, when they get the infection, the mortality rate's really, really high. It's really unfortunate. So there's that. There's also some very weird things that happen, and I did mention this in my book. There's a native organism that lives on this continent that is a parasite of multiple hosts at different points in its life. And what it does is it attacks tadpoles when they're young, and it actually burrows into the parts of their body that has the cells that grow limbs. and it either makes them grow not enough limbs or too many limbs. And so it makes them look really freakish, like frogs with like 10 legs or like 30 toes on one foot, or very strange things. And so there's a really strange thing that happens with that, in that it causes deformities, which clearly aren't a benefit to the amphibians. They are a benefit to that parasite, though, because according to at least the scientific theories we have on that now, essentially that parasite is making that amphibian more vulnerable to predation by herons, and herons are its main host as a parasite.
Wow.
So it literally manipulates these frogs into growing extra limbs so that they can't get away as well, or not enough limbs so they can't get away as well. And because they kind of don't move as efficiently as other frogs around them, they are targeted by herons. So kind of
amazing.
crazy thing, yeah.
The parasite's thinking of the end game there.
Yeah, pretty crazy to think about, right? Complex relationships.
So what are there like certain signs from reptiles and amphibians that we would look for, that we could be able to put them into that class of things, like rule out, say, birds and mammals? Is there something in the tracks or sign?
Definitely.
How do you go through that process?
Yeah, there's a lot I could say on that. I mean, I basically wrote the book on that, right? Because it's such a vast topic. But, like one of the most obvious things for snakes, one of the most common things you find with snakes, and especially in our area where a lot of our substrates are not necessarily perfect for showing snake trails, is snake skins, shed skins. And as humans, we shed skin too, but we shed in very, very small parts, right? So we're constantly shedding our skin. But reptiles, especially snakes, shed their skin all at once. So as they grow, as they reach a certain point in their growth, they have to shed their skin, and it basically peels off their entire body like a sock, like you'd pull a sock off. So it comes out inside out and backwards, and they leave that behind. And so finding that is like very distinct sign.
Confirmation.
Yeah, very good confirmation. And I've actually used that to find places that are used a lot by snakes. Like if you are flipping logs or rocks or boards or things like that, and you find a lot of shed skins in the same place, that indicates that keeps getting used again and again by that animal.
We were talking about search image a little bit before we started this podcast. Is there a particular place you would search to find shed skins, or can that just happen anywhere? Or do they like seek out certain areas to shed skin?
Yeah, that varies from species to species, and I actually did an entire chapter just on sheds in my book, because it's such a common type of sign for reptiles, specifically for snakes, but also to some extent for lizards. And depending on where they spend most of their time, that's where you're going to find the shed. So for instance, there are some snakes that actually live most of their life in trees. There are snakes like the rough green snake or the vine snake, or some of the rat snakes actually spend a lot of time either in trees or up in the rafters of buildings. And so you're likely to find their sheds up there, suspended. There's another snake in California in the Southwest called a lyre snake, which often you'll find their sheds hanging out high up in cliff faces, sticking out of cracks, because these snakes like to live up there and eat bats. And so that's most likely where you're going to find those. But generally speaking, sheds are going to be, undercover objects, right? So like rocks, logs, boards, sometimes wrapped around the base of a shrub where a snake tends to hang out. And they have to rub their face on objects in order to get the shed process started. So it tends to get hung up on certain things as they're doing that.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So it's kind of like you trying to peel your sock off without using your hands, right? You'd have
to
like rub against things in your room until you get that sock off, and then that's probably where you'd leave it. It's kind of a similar experience for them.
What about their scat? I know, like, for example, birds, they don't pee, right? So their scat has got this white to it or whatever.
Yeah, it's uric acid, yep.
Is that also reptiles and amphibians? Is that?
Yeah, reptiles, yes. Amphibians are different, and yeah, and actually sometimes looking at the scat of reptiles, when you have large reptiles that leave large scats, it can be similar to birds because they leave scats that both have a portion that is just feces and then a portion that's uric acid, which comes out as two separate pellets usually. So in the book, I actually have a chapter on scats, and there's a photo section that just shows similar scats in there. And with birds, typically their scats are much more watery, and especially the uric part comes out as watery. So like when they deposit it or they squirt it out, it like drips down. Whereas for reptiles, it's usually semi-solid or solid, so it comes out fairly dry, and so it actually has some shape to it. So like a lot of lizard scats, you'll have like an elongated pellet for the feces and then like some sort of smaller whitish pellet for the uric acid that's concentrated. And the shape of those, both relative to each other and relative to the scats and uric pellets of other species, are distinct enough to where you can say, okay, this is the scat of a fence lizard, and this is the scat of a horned lizard, and this is the scat of a whiptail. So you just like with mammals, you can actually use the shape and size and things like that to determine species.
Oh, great! Is there diet pretty much the same?
No, actually, it varies quite a bit, and it depends on size quite a bit. So, you can have, for instance, if we just talk about lizards for a moment, right? Like the smallest lizards are going for such tiny, tiny invertebrates. Like some of our smallest lizards are like the ground skink, or like some of the geckos found in the Florida Keys, which are so small that you could have several of them sit on your pinky finger comfortably. So we're talking
like several lizards on your
yeah,
pinky finger.
So several of these tiny geckos sitting on your pinky finger together. So we're talking about very, very small lizards, right? And so they're obviously limited by just how big their mouth is. And,
right.
And,
okay.
yeah, and so lizards often will eat, whatever they can get into their mouth, but to some extent, some species are very specific about their preferences. So I would say most lizards eat invertebrates, but some of the larger ones eat vertebrates too. So things like collared lizards and leopard lizards actually eat other lizards. The biggest lizard we have, biggest native lizard, is the Gila monster, and it actually eats things like mice and quail eggs and even baby rabbits sometimes. And we're talking about a lizard that is almost 2 feet long. So
wow, that's huge.
That's huge compared to that tiny, gecko sitting on your pinky finger.
You mentioned eggs. Let's see, all reptiles, they lay eggs for the most part, right?
Most of them do. So there are some reptiles that actually retain their eggs in their bodies, and then they give birth to live young. And so they don't actually develop eggs in their bodies that ever have shells. They're actually these translucent containers that each of them have a individual embryo in them. And for instance, like rattlesnakes, no rattlesnakes lay eggs. They actually give birth to live young. So when the young are coming out of the female, they actually come out fully formed, and they immediately, break out of this little sac, and they yawn and they crawl around. And rattlesnakes are really cool because with a lot of species, the young will hang out with their mom until their first shed, and that can last up to a month. So they're actually, there's some research being done about parental involvement being present there.
Oh,
and we think of reptiles as these like simplistic creatures, but some of them actually show some parental care, and rattlesnakes are one of those.
So I'd imagine that maybe what the shed has to do with how fast it's growing. So is that right?
Yes.
So when they're young, they shed a lot more than when they're older.
Yeah, and it's really dependent on, it's dependent on their genetics. It's dependent on how frequently they eat. And so, for instance, if we talk about baby rattlesnakes, they're probably not going to get their first meal for a couple of weeks. And they're actually born with a yolk sac in their belly. And so they're actually feeding off that yolk initially, at least for a couple of days. And then once that absorbs, then they're out foraging for food. And rattlesnakes are really cool too, because every time they shed, they add another segment to the end of their tail.
Oh,
Right?
really?
Because
Okay.
the babies start out and they only have a button, so they can't actually make a sound when they're born. They can't make a sound until that first shed, when they have an extra layer on the end of their tail, so there are two segments to rub against each other. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Isn't that cool?
Yeah, I find snakes interesting. What about their gaits or locomotion, or what do you even call that in a snake?
Yeah, I've I really debated what to call that, because snakes are so funny and so strange compared to the animals we're used to tracking, which are usually quadrupeds, four-legged creatures, right? And we think of their gaits as like, some type of walk or trot or lope or gallop. But snakes basically leave a continuous line on the ground. And so what felt most appropriate for me is to call them trails, because they're leaving this continuous trail. And to say they're tracks would imply that they're broken up, but that doesn't really happen with snake trails very much. And there are, I still like to use the word gait to describe the different forms of locomotion, because maybe it's just a force of habit as a tracker, I'm so used to it, but it felt appropriate to do that. And so the gaits that I would describe for snakes are, for starters, is the most common one is called lateral undulation, which is that serpentine S-curve motion that we're really used to seeing with snakes. And then the next one after that is called rectilinear locomotion, and that's usually used by big heavy snakes, and they're literally walking forward a few muscles at a time. And it kind of looks, if you ever watch a millipede up close and the way that their feet roll together, it almost looks like little waves traveling down their body. That's how snakes move using rectilinear locomotion. Really beautiful to watch.
That trail would just be a straight line.
Relatively straight line,
Okay.
yeah. And in some substrates, you might actually see the belly scales, which are called scutes or ventral scales, showing up as little lines inside the trail. But not very often, because the substrate has to be very, very fine, and the snake has to be fairly large for those scales to show up. So you've got those two, and then my favorite one is sidewinding, because it's such a weird gait.
And that's the one where that's the one you see in the movies sometimes, where it's like a little S and then a space and another S.
Yeah, and that's really the only gait where, when some snakes move like that, they literally will make tracks, because their trail will separate into pieces, right? So it'll make this kind of like elongated J or S shape. And what the snake is doing is it's actually lifting as much of its body off the ground as it can as it moves forward. And generally the snakes that do that, and the snakes that are best at doing that, is actually the sidewinding rattlesnake, or the sidewinder. And they leave perfect sidewinding trails. It's actually one of my favorite tracks to see.
I've
in the
never
wild.
seen that. I would love to see that.
So beautiful. And that J shape that you see at the one end of each of those tracks is actually not made by the tail, but by the neck. And so the way that little curve in the J points is telling you the direction of travel.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so you can know exactly which way they're going when you see that. Yeah, and if you ever get to watch a sidewinder moving, it's just mesmerizing. It's so beautiful. So you've got those three, and then you've got this gait, which I hesitate to call it a gait, because it's more of like a panicked movement that a lot of snakes do. And it's this thing that they do when they're either on a really smooth surface or they're really frightened. And it's usually done by smaller snakes that tend to kind of move more erratically when they're frightened. And it's called slide pushing. And that's when they send this big wave of motion down their body, and they try and push out to one side or the other really rapidly. And they end up sliding mostly in place when they do that. And I say I hesitate to call it a gait, because they don't really use it to travel very far. It's kind of like seeing a dog or some sort of mammal like panicking and running in place.
Yeah.
You wouldn't really call that a gait, but it's still an expression of locomotion, and that's called slide pushing. And then the last one, which is a form of motion, but It's also limited in terms of seeing this in the field because it's used for very specific situations, is called the concertina gait, or the concertina style of snake locomotion. And that's where they literally fold their bodies in like an accordion, and so half their body will straighten out and the other half will fold up, so you'll have a bunch of tight S-curves in their body, and then the part that just folded up will straighten out, and then the front part will form a bunch of S-curves. And I know my description isn't doing it justice, but basically they do that when they're in a tight space, and so they're pushing against two objects at the same time to move forward.
Oh, I see.
Or they're doing that when they're on a branch. So some snakes are very good climbers, or they can do that while they're hugging a tree. So like half their body will be wrapped around the tree and the other half will stretch upwards, and then the part that was stretched upwards will then wrap around the tree, and the bottom half will then continue upwards to catch up with the rest of its body. It's this very strange thing to watch, but it's very effective.
Do snakes use different gaits for, I mean, okay, in mammals, most mammals have a particular gait they prefer, but they can, for the most part, use the whole range of gaits. Is that the same with all these snake?
Yeah, it is. And that's part of what makes identifying snakes by their trails really difficult, is just like a mammal, like let's say a coyote, for instance, which a lot of us are familiar with as trackers. A coyote can go from a slow walk to a moderate walk to a trot to a lope to a gallop to a bound. It can do all these weird things in a relatively short distance in a trail, and those are all expressions of speed, of how it feels, of what it's doing, whether it's chasing a rabbit or playing with another coyote or running from perceived danger. And snakes are the same. So snakes tend to default to the gaits most of the time that are most energy efficient. And I would argue that every animal is always going to fall into these most efficient gaits. Some people call them baseline gaits, whenever possible. And so, for instance, if you're out somewhere in the Mojave Desert on a sand dune and you're trailing a sidewinder, it's almost always going to be sidewinding, because the way it's built and the way that the sidewinding gait works is most efficient for that environment, right? So it's this short, fat, squat little snake, and by lifting its body up that way on the loose sand, it actually uses less energy than trying to do, say, like lateral undulation, which is that beautiful serpentine S-curve pattern that we see in snake trails usually. But if you take another snake in that same environment, like a really long, skinny snake, like a coach whip snake, that actually moves very quickly, it's not going to be very efficient at doing a sidewinding. It probably won't even try it, because its body is so long that it's going to struggle to get that much of its body off the ground in order to move forward. But it's very efficient with lateral undulation, with those S-curves. And so it's going to do that most of the time. So if we stick to one species, let's just say garter snakes, because garter snakes are almost everywhere, right?
Those are the ones I find.
And those are the ones I find the most too. And they do leave beautiful trails as well. And they're actually one of the best creatures to study, because they're found all over this country, and they're easy to find and easy to move to a substrate if they haven't already left tracks for you on that substrate. And you can just watch them, and you can watch how they respond to you and how they respond to the peaks and valleys in that substrate, and also when they speed up or slow down, how their trail changes and their gait expression changes in that trail. So I've watched a garter snake go from, say, a slow lateral undulation to then a fast lateral undulation when it gets spooked by me or some other animal, to then going into rectilinear locomotion, which is that that sort of inchworm going in a straight line when it's going really slow, to then going up a steep loose sand dune and actually sidewinding, and then back again, as soon as the angle of the slope changes and its needs change and its response to other factors changes. So just like any other animal, they are going to use different gaits at different times. Yeah. Absolutely.
Let's move to imagine you probably have a chapter for each kind of animal, like snakes, salamanders, lizards, frogs, and toads. They all have their own chapter.
Absolutely.
Let's look at frogs and toads. First of all, I guess, what is the difference between a frog and a toad?
Yeah. So there's some people in the scientific community, there's a tendency for people to either be lumpers or splitters, right? So splitters are the people that always are dividing things into finer and finer categories, and the lumpers are trying to lump them into more general categories. And so you can argue that, toads are a kind of frog, right? Like some people would say that. But if we were to really divide those two categories up, we would say that frogs tend to be creatures that have relatively smooth skin and usually have a closer affinity to water, like they really need to be by water, whereas toads have drier skin, usually bumpier skin, and they can actually be in much more dry environments. And when I was traveling in the Southwest, when I was looking for amphibians, in the most extreme environments, the most extreme desert environments, the creatures you would find in those environments that were in that group were toads. And they would sometimes be buried underground for months at a time, waiting for the rains to come back.
Wow.
So you look at this landscape, like you go to the White Sands in New Mexico in the summer, and you're like, there's no way there's any amphibians living here. It is 115 degrees. There's no water for 30 miles in any direction. There's no way. But as soon as it rains, toads literally pop out of the ground.
That's amazing.
It's pretty amazing.
What are some signs if you went into an area? How would you, and you wanted to know if frogs or toads were there? What would you search for?
Yeah, so being amphibians, even the toads themselves, the most desert adapted toads are still going to be attracted to water. So the first thing I would do is look for some sort of water source. So around here in the Pacific Northwest, some of the best places to look for frog or toad tracks would be along rivers, under bridges along rivers especially, but also around drying ponds. And sometimes the best tracks I've found have been in really shallow mud puddles in the middle of forest roads. And often those, when you get that super fine substrate that trackers dream about, right?
Yeah.
That like silt that is so fine you can see your fingerprint in it. That's where I look for frog and toad tracks. And usually when I find them in that stuff, you can see every detail. It's just incredible.
So if you found one of those sets of tracks in that fine mud puddle there, could you tell if it was a frog or a toad?
Yeah, oftentimes you can. And if I was to generalize, make a sweeping generalization about their physical structure, frogs tend to have more tapered toes and longer feet, and also frogs tend to jump quite a bit more and can jump quite further, whereas toads are built much more to walk or to take very short hops. And so their physical features, their toes are stubbier and rounder and shorter, and they are often walking through the substrate or they're taking very short hops. And also, with a lot of the toad species in North America, the undersurface of their feet are covered in these bumps called tubercles, which each species has like a different pattern and different sizes and shapes. And so you can use that just like the morphology on, say, small mammal feet, and you can actually determine species that way. So you can get pretty deep into this stuff.
That's pretty cool. So did you say how many toes they have?
Yeah, so generally speaking, frogs and toads both have 4 toes on their front feet and 5 toes on their hind feet. And so whenever you see a set of 4 tracks that are hopping, or jumping or walking, and you see the front feet, and the front feet kind of look like little K's facing each other, those would be, frog or toad. And then the hind feet kind of look like these very strange hind feet, because they have very long toes on their hind feet, are like these 2 sets of dots that are sort of arching away from those front feet that are facing each other. It's really hard to describe without looking at an image, but
I sometimes find a lot of frog tracks out on Savi Island, and if they're wind blowing at all, sometimes I have a really hard time telling which direction they're even going.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, initially when I started this, when I saw tracks that were windblown, sometimes it was hard to tell a set of bounding mouse tracks from hopping frog tracks, because if you can't see the details, they can be pretty similar, because they're both kind of boxy and the 4 feet kind of land close together, and I've certainly made that mistake many times.
So your book probably covers turtles and tortoises also.
It does, yeah.
And is that the same thing, turtles, tortoise, the difference between them as frogs and toads, dry and wet?
Yeah, actually very similar, so again, if we were to lump them together, we would say that tortoises are just a kind of turtle. They're all turtles. But, there's only a few tortoise species in North America. There's basically 3. There's 2 kinds of desert tortoises in the Southwest, and then there's the gopher tortoise. And that's it. And they are a dryland species. They live in pretty arid environments, and they're all species that create burrows and are like pretty intense diggers. And specifically like the Mojave Desert tortoise, that one lives in some of the most extreme environments on this continent. I mean, we're talking about temperatures of 120 plus in some of those deserts, and sometimes no water for several years at a time. So these creatures are like incredibly adapted for arid situations. And then you've got some turtles that are kind of in between, like box turtles. There's a few box turtle species that are adapted to the Southwest too, but they're a little bit more water dependent. So they do live in some really dry areas, but they do need water a little bit more frequently. And then there's the turtles we're most familiar with, things like red-eared sliders, which everyone knows from the pet shop and things like that. And they are turtles that have to have water, and they will actually die of dehydration if they're away from water for any extended period of time. So there's it's a significant range of difference in their needs.
And turtles all lay eggs.
They all lay eggs, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So here's a tracker question. If I find an egg shell and I bring it to you, could you tell that from a bird egg shell? Is there differences between?
Yes, absolutely.
How would you do that?
Yeah, and so basically reptile eggs tend to be much more leathery, and so if I was to take a chicken egg in one hand and I was to take, say, a snapping turtle egg in the other, and I was to squeeze down on those 2 eggs, the chicken egg wouldn't give it all until I cracked it, right? Until my fingers broke through the shell. But a snapping turtle egg would actually give a little bit. And it's actually really common to find turtle nests that have been raided by raccoons or skunks or other mammals, because turtle eggs are apparently delicious to a lot of creatures. And so it's actually really common, especially in the southeast or any place where there's a lot of turtles that are nesting, to come up on some sandy spot where you find this little dig and there's a bunch of these leathery little wrinkled whitish shells laying around from turtle eggs. And I actually have some in my collection from traveling around that I wish I could show everybody through the microphone, but honestly, it doesn't work that way.
I don't think I've ever really seen turtle eggs.
But they're pretty neat. We're so used to bird eggs, and those shells are very hard and like fragile, but reptile eggs are very different, much more like leathery and sometimes papery. Yeah, very, very different to the touch.
Are they, can turtles only use one gate?
Yeah, turtle gates. Yeah, so that was a mind blower for me, is that, I'm so used to tracking mammals, and with mammals, their slowest gates are walks, right? But for turtles, they don't ever really go beyond a walk because they're not really designed to. And if you think about a turtle, it's this really heavy platform on these 4 legs, so it's like these columns that are supporting this heavy platform. And if you were to try and move that too fast, that platform would tip over and fall, right? And so the way that turtles walk is they basically have to move 1 foot at a time, and that's all they can do. And so even the fastest turtle gait is still an understep walk. Yeah. So I actually had to break down understep walks into 3 different categories.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And, and without having like a video or something to show you, or having you read that section in the book, it'd be very hard to describe that, because I basically had to break down the understep walk into 3 categories. And those categories, well, 2 of those categories didn't really exist before as descriptions. And I just had to make up language around it, because there was nothing in the tracking literature that talked about turtle gaits to that degree. And I was seeing that there were differences, but I just couldn't find anything. So I basically came up with 3 terms, and I recommend you look them up in the book. And basically there's the fastest of them is the understep walk. Then there's the half understep walk and the full understep walk. And so the full understep walk is actually the slowest, and the half understep walk is in the middle. And yeah, and it's these crazy like breakdowns of how the turtle moves so slowly that it literally will take 1 step with 1 leg, and then it has to take 2 steps with the leg behind it in order to catch up, which is so strange for us as trackers, because we're used to tracking animals that have, gaits that basically the front and the hind limbs match up. Right?
Wait, you're saying the hind foot takes 2 steps for the 1 front foot step?
Yeah, at the slowest turtle gaits, that's actually what's happening.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about, and it's probably hard for the listeners to picture that, but if you study turtles and you watch them, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's a very strange thing. But turtles are, well, everybody knows, turtles are not that fast, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are, there's probably situations and, maybe going, like sliding down a hill or something, or panicking, down a very steep grade, jumping into water or something, where they go slightly faster than an understep walk. But generally speaking, when you see turtle tracks, that's what it's going to be. Yeah.
So salamanders. Tell me something about salamanders' tracks or sign.
Yeah, so salamanders are, another group of animals that are just not generally thought of as particularly fast. And kind of like turtles, they're usually slow-moving creatures, so they're usually doing some sort of walk. I actually got some photographic records of salamanders trotting, but that was really unusual. And I actually had to search really deep into the literature and scientific work on studying salamander physiology and how salamanders moved to even get any kind of supporting evidence that talked about them trotting. But generally they're walking, so it's usually understep walk or direct register walk is what they're doing. And with salamanders, just like with frogs and toads, they have 4 toes on their front and 5 toes on their back foot. So that's what you're going to see in their tracks. And then usually a tail drag in the middle of some sort. Mm-hmm.
What about, what was you have like a memorable moment of tracking while you were making this book, for going out and traveling around? I'm sure you probably have tons. But
So many. Yeah. I think it's hard to pick a favorite. I mean, I actually spent a good portion in the book, towards the tail end of the book, I just put in a bunch of my experiences, like personal stories of tracking, because there's so many stories I would love to share. And right now, the one that's coming to mind is finding python tracks in the Everglades. And maybe not a lot of the listeners know, but we have pythons in the Everglades. They're not native, but they are definitely present, and there's reproducing populations of them there. They're Burmese pythons, which can grow up to over 20 feet long. Whoa. So, as a tracker, I'm used to seeing snake tracks of snakes that are 2-3 feet long. Maybe a really big one would be like 6 foot long snake, and that would be impressive. And so you have to kind of put yourself in my shoes. The first time I came across python tracks in the Everglades is my search image, and we mentioned this earlier, which means this sort of expected filter that I have for what tracks I'm looking for didn't include anything of this size. So I was standing in the middle of this mostly dry salt marsh on the south end of the Everglades and looking at these trails through the mud. And for a while I couldn't figure out what I was looking at, because it was so out of my realm of comprehension that a snake trail, when the snake is going in a straight line So we're talking rectilinear locomotion, right? The snake trail was 6 inches wide. So that's just the belly of this snake touching down, right? It's not going side to side. 6 inches wide. And it took me a while to realize, like, oh my goodness, that is a snake trail. So that means that that's just the belly of that snake. So this snake was probably at least as big around as my leg. And
that's huge.
Probably several times as long as my body. Yeah, so we're talking about a huge python. And that was really mind-blowing just to see that. And also to see the tracks of alligators. Alligators are another giant reptile species that, for us here in the Pacific Northwest, they're kind of almost a myth, because the only alligators we have is alligator lizards, which are like, 5 inches long. But down there, alligators are the top predators of that ecosystem. They eat everything from small birds and frogs to, as they fully mature as adults and grow up to 11, 12 plus feet long, eat full-grown deer. So they are these huge creatures, and their tracks, like, I saw tracks that were the size of my hands.
Wow.
And their trails are, some of the really big gators had trails that were almost 2 feet wide. So we're talking about huge animals that weigh several hundred pounds. And they're also, just like beavers, ecological engineers. And this is another thing that I learned that was really cool, is they literally create these deep ponds in the wintertime when the water's really low. And these ponds trap water, and then they concentrate fish in them and frogs, and a lot of creatures come to these ponds, including birds. And so the gators like to have these watery pools for themselves, but also it attracts food for them, right? So these birds come to feed on the fish and frogs, and the gators eat the birds. But in the process of making those ponds, they are literally making these safe havens for creatures that during low water times have a place to be. And so they are shaping the ecosystem in a way that creates habitat for other creatures. And we don't think of reptiles as being ecological engineers, but gators certainly are. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
that
is crazy.
That's awesome. So your book is going to be released when?
October 1st is when it is officially released on Amazon.
But we can pre-order it now.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming and sharing all this knowledge. And I'm really excited about getting the book. And once again, the book is Tracks and Sign of Reptiles and Amphibians.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Garth. And I really encourage everyone out there who's listening to go out in the field and track, track around your house, track inside your house, and get out into the woods and just go and practice. Whatever creatures you have to look at and whatever tracks and sign you have to study, go do it. Nothing beats putting in dirt time. So have fun out there and happy tracking, everybody.
Great. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.